Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the 2020 MTP SCS update. We're going to give everyone just a few minutes to join, so we'll get started in about 2 minutes. Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us today. You are participating in the 2020 MTP SCS Update webinar. We have some really good information to share with you today. Before we start, just some logistics. You all are muted, so if you have a question at any time, please type it into the question box. We'll be stopping several times throughout the webinar to address your questions, and then we will also be providing contact information for the presenters today at the end of the webinar. You can also visit our website at SACOG.org to get the contact information for any SACOG staff to follow up with them individually. We are recording this webinar, and it will be posted on the SACOG.org website. You will also be receiving an email at the conclusion of the webinar with the recording. So again, please type your questions into the chat box at any time. Without further ado, we'll get started. My name is Adrienne Moretz, and I'll be your moderator today. We'll also be hearing from Clint Holson, who's the MTP project manager, and Bruce Griesenbach, who manages the data modeling here at SACOG. So I'll turn it over to Clint to talk about what we're going to go over today.
Great. So thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We are just entering kind of the big push on analysis for this next update. So what we're hoping to do today is to give a really quick kind of summary preview of two of the major components of the plan. That's the land use allocation and the transportation project list, and some of the analysis that we're going to do to try to hone in on those two major components for a final plan, at least a draft preferred scenario framework that we'll adopt for the final plan in December. And then Bruce is going to take a deeper dive into two of the new major elements that we're introducing into our analysis for this plan, and that is system pricing and how that might affect the performance of the plan and how people travel, and then new technologies, autonomous vehicles and other new mobility options. So he'll dive a little bit deeper into that and how we're hoping that will play into this plan update. And then we are approaching our public workshops later this summer, so I'll give a quick wrap up and talk about those that are coming up. So just to check in on where we are in the process, we really kicked this off the end of last year with doing a lot of one-on-one meetings with local agencies, sending out the transportation project list from the current plan to get updated assumptions, updated projects, to kind of inventory, planning activities, things like that. Just kind of update our baseline of information that go into this plan. In December, our board adopted the policy framework for the plan that kind of gives us our marching orders on what they want this to achieve with this plan update. A couple of really important elements of that policy framework is that we're really hoping that we can maintain at least the performance of the last plan. If you've joined us on previous webinars or other formats of hearing about the MTP, you know that we have a lot more stringent greenhouse gas targets that we're trying to meet with this plan. And so we are looking at what it's going to take to maintain that performance and to achieve those greenhouse gas targets that were passed down to us from the state. So we've just wrapped up kind of the initial call for transportation projects. Just this past Friday, we wrapped up a review of the discussion draft land use scenario for the plan. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. It's going to our board next week, so we will get something out to all of our local jurisdictions, and it's going to be posted on our website. So if anyone wants more detail, that is forthcoming. But kind of the summary level information, what's important on this slide to note is overall in this plan, despite going out an additional 4 years, we're dealing with less growth than in the current plan. And so what you're seeing on this slide is a comparison of the employment and the housing growth in the current plan compared to what we have in the discussion draft, or what we're dealing with in the discussion draft, and then segregated by different community types. And across all community types, we have less growth overall. In terms of how that growth is distributed, because this scenario, this discussion draft scenario, is really a performance-based scenario, we're trying to see what it would take to maintain the performance of the last plan to hit that really stringent 19% greenhouse gas target. Just as a point of reference, the target for the current plan was 16%. So we have a tighter target of going up additional 3% reduction over the last plan. So we're trying to see what it's going to take or how we might be able to achieve that performance target, along with all of our other goals, our air quality conformity targets, our mode share targets, all of the other performance indicators that we look at in the plan. We're really pushing to see what it might take to maintain the performance from the last plan. So in that call for kind of review of these numbers segregated by jurisdiction that we just closed on Friday, we heard from a number of jurisdictions expressing, some minor refinements to our numbers, but we also heard, there are some concerns with the level of infill growth in established and center and corridor communities compared to those in the more new growth developing communities in the greenfield areas. And we're going to be looking at those things over the next several months, over the summer, trying to refine our land use assumptions for a draft preferred scenario. So this is certainly not the final. This is a starting place that is for testing purposes only to see what it takes to get to our performance goals for the plan. Ultimately, our land use allocation for this plan needs to be aspirational, but it also needs to be achievable. And so what we want to do is work with our local jurisdictions, work with partners, stakeholders, and then our board needs to feel comfortable that they can endorse our land use allocations given all of the trade-offs, given the implementation challenges associated with the plan. So what we'll be doing over the course of the next several months, and those of you that are with local planning staff or local public works staff, you'll be hearing from us in the next several days with some responses, some initial responses to the comments you provided on our draft land use allocation. We're going to be coming back with additional questions about, if there are concerns for the allocation in your community, what the nature of those concerns are, but more than that, kind of what are the major obstacles to implementing the plan? What are the refinements we need to be considering as we explore a draft preferred scenario for later this year? So on the transportation project list side, and I'll pause. Feel free, I'm moving on to transportation project list nominations now, but if you have questions or you want more information about the land use allocation, like I said, we are sending that out, so you'll see the detail soon. That is just the summary information. I have Jennifer Hargrove here, who is one of our land use planners. We're both available to try to answer your questions. So as they occur to you, please send those in. But I'm going to move on to the transportation project list now, and then we'll pause before Bruce kicks in with his presentation on pricing and on new mobility and technology. The transportation project list nominations. The current plan has around $35 billion in total investments, and it's kind of true. It's true of every plan cycle. We have far more need or far more requests for transportation investment than we have financial capacity to pay for. The plan has to be financially constrained, so we develop a revenue forecast for the plan, and we compare our investments to that revenue forecast. We have less growth overall, so much of the investment in the plan comes from development activities. And so having less growth overall means that we're going to be fairly constrained on the revenues, on the financial constraint side of the plan. So the project list nominations that we received represent a $2 billion increase in the requested road capacity, like expansions, widenings, new roads, over the current plan. And then it's also got about $2 billion in new roadway maintenance and rehabilitation requests over the current plan. And I think a lot of those maintenance and rehabilitation requests are coming with an assumption of ongoing infusion of money from SB1, especially on the state side. There's more money coming in, and so the project list nominations are reflecting that. On the roadway capacity side, we have some work to do to really figure out what of those new roadway capacity projects can fit into this financial constraint, but also are going to be the best fit for the land use allocation that we have. What is the right package of investments to get the best performance and get the best bang for our buck in this plan update? So we don't yet have a draft scenario or a set of recommendations or anything on the transportation project list. The land use allocation comes first, and then we will build a set of transportation investments, working with our stakeholders, working with local agencies to build that package of investments that accompany that land use. So I'm going to pause there before we go on to Bruce, just to see if there are any questions specific to either the transportation project list or the land use allocation.
Question came in from Matt Baker on why the employment projections dropped so much, and the gist of it is that the 2020 plan projections kind of factored in the recovery from the recession. The 2016 plan employment projections started from it was 2012 base year, started from a much lower number of jobs. And so that recovery has largely happened, and the growth in the 2020 MTP is kind of net of the recovery.
Great. We'll leave just a few more seconds for you to type in your questions for Clint before we move on. Okay, great. So we have a few more questions that our MTP team is going to be working on, but in the meantime, I'm going to introduce Bruce Griesenbeck, who's going to be talking about some new technology and pricing.
Okay. Thanks, Adrian. So I'm going to start with an item that we've been rolling through our committees and boards over the last year, in part starting with some of the information that came to them through the GHG target resetting process. And then as the SCS has taken off, we've been much more pointed about presenting this as an option that the board needs to discuss as part of the SCS development this time. And the issue really is pricing. The starting point for the why part of pricing and potentially user fees for this as an area that we need to consider for this plan is that the fuel tax is ultimately going to be eroded by both electrification of the vehicle fleet and by more efficient vehicles, higher MPG vehicles. And it's the problem that has plagued the fuel excise tax since over the last 20 years. SB1 was a great reset of the excise tax to a level that was more in tune with what the needs on maintenance especially are. But over time, even that reset will ultimately get eroded by those two factors, that more and more vehicles are being powered by things other than fuel, and they won't be paying excise tax at all. There is some information in the webinar slides and in the staff report for this item from May that would be really interesting for people who want to dig deeper into that. But that was the starting point for why we felt that it was an imperative to include something on pricing and user fees in this SCS, at least in terms of just making sure that there was a good discussion of it. A second issue which we have raised is when you look at the fuel excise tax, apart from the sustainability of it over time in terms of meeting maintenance needs, the fuel tax itself really varies widely in terms of what people pay in terms of the type of vehicle that they use. So up until 2020, you can avoid the excise tax entirely by purchasing an electric vehicle. In 2020, there will be a vehicle surcharge for zero-emission vehicles that SB1 put in place, and that will partially change that kind of disparity, I guess, or that variance by vehicle type. But the fact is, if your activities require a vehicle that consumes more fuel per mile, lower MPG, like a pickup truck or a van that's needed to haul around goods, or if your household finances allow you to only purchase a vehicle that maybe an older vehicle that's less fuel efficient, in terms of your use, you're paying way more on a per mile basis than if you have a Prius or an electric vehicle or another high efficiency vehicle. When we presented that item to our committees, we definitely got some feedback that some of that variance by vehicle type is intentionally built in to the excise tax based on wanting to having the goal of reducing emissions. We still think that the amount of variance across vehicle types is something that we should consider as we move forward in terms of replacement of the fuel tax. So that was another point that we wanted to raise with our board, and we have in the May staff discussion, and try and treat as something we want to address as part of this plan update. The ability to maintain roads based on that declining fuel tax will also get eroded. The current maintenance scheme based on primarily on the fuel excise taxes hasn't worked. SB1 again resets that for a time, but ultimately it's going to erode in the same way. And finally, a lot of other regions around the country, around the state and around the country are really using pricing and at the lower end of the scheme of pricing, managed lanes or express lanes are one way that a lot of regions within the state and around the country are using pricing to manage congestion and provide modal alternatives for people, for travelers to use. Caltrans, to their credit, is just embarked on a managed lane study, a comprehensive managed lane study. That study is at the early days of that study. District 3 is navigating that one. It'll be a great project to be doing in parallel with the MTP and the SCS this time around. At the other end of the extreme in terms of pricing and user fees is literally converting what's now the fuel excise tax to more of a mileage-based system, so that people are paying based on the amount of mileage they drive rather than the vehicles that they're driving around in. And our hope is to have a healthy discussion with our board over the next few months, and I'm going to go to the next slide just to talk about what's coming up. In June, and Clint mentioned this, I think, in his presentation, we will be bringing our approach for developing the scenario, the discussion draft scenario, to our board. We will include some analysis of pricing alternatives as part of that, or we will be recommending to the board to do that based on their level of interest. So far, our expectation is that they'll want to see some analysis or evaluation of the scenario, which including some different approaches to pricing or user fees, and that'll be presented to the board in June for consideration. Assuming that they're interested in that and having that be part of the discussion draft, we'll be doing some evaluation of the discussion draft scenario that Clint mentioned in his presentation to include some pricing and user fee options attached to it, and bringing forth some of the results so that the board could see, like, what are the costs and what are the benefits of including pricing in some of the discussion draft as a scenario. That'll all trundle towards December, when the board will have an actual discussion and consideration of whether pricing elements should be included either as part of the preferred scenario or as a potential adjunct to the preferred scenario, as a parallel scenario, if you will. I want to emphasize right now, this is all in the discussion stage with our board. The board is the party that would have to take action on whether pricing is really part of this MTP as a policy or as a goal. We're doing our best to try and continue to bring information forth on kind of the why part of this, like what types of problems can we try and address using pricing or user fees. We're trying not to get into the how question right now until that why part of the discussion is really had. And we are really trying to stay out of the way of the board in terms of leading them along. We do want to bring the information forth, but ultimately it's going to be their action that would make that part of this plan. It's obviously a tough topic, but I think the points of consensus so far, I think there's general consensus among our board that over time the fuel excise tax is something we have to look at as something that's not going to be sustainable in the long haul. And then once you get to that point, how you replace that or what you do about that, there's lots of different options, and we hope to have a full discussion of that as part of this plan. There's a bunch of slides. I'm going to pause here for just a moment. There's a bunch of slides that I'm going to go through really quickly that were included in the staff report. And then there's some slides that we had queued up if questions come up. I'm not going to get into those unless the questions do come up. So I'm going to race through about 6 slides that were part of the staff report in May, and then go on to the next item. So this slide just shows kind of the trend line on gross fuel excise tax, those are the bars, compared to VMT growth. Again, the last bar, the 2017 budget year in the state, includes the first kind of increment of SB1 revenues, and it shows sort of us getting back to kind of in line with VMT growth or towards that. Ultimately, that's going to probably decline again as the fleet changes. The next slide is just some information that came from ARB related to longer-term projections about what's happening to our passenger vehicle fleet in the state of California. And the blue part is conventional internal combustion engine. The orange, gray, and yellow parts show the hybrid PEV and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles sort of entering into the fleet over time, and the decline of internal combustion engines is what really drives some of that concern of the sustainability of the fuel tax. The following slide, or the next slide, just shows kind of a typical vehicle. It's based on 14,000 miles traveled, which is sort of an average mileage annually for a vehicle in California. Just based on the type of vehicle and the miles per gallon that the vehicle gets, what fuel taxes they're paying for that 14,000 miles. And then way over on the right, the plug-in electric for the first time there will be a surcharge on registration of zero-emission vehicles, and that's purely SB1. Prior to that, there wasn't really any usage fee in any sort that related to electric vehicles. What's shown on the next slide is more about some of the travel demand forecasting that we have to do. And one of the things we have to do is calculate the average auto operating costs. And this is for the horizon year of our plan. So 2035, 2036, and 2040 projections. And what's happening is because vehicles are getting more efficient or expected to get more efficient, the overall cost of driving is reducing, and our forecasts are sensitive to that. So in essence, over the course of the 3 plans, the average operating costs that we expected based on forecasts out to 2030 to the horizon year have gone from about 31 cents a mile to 28 cents a mile. And in our next, the plan that we're currently in, it's likely to be as low as 23 cents a mile. And all that reduction in cost generates additional travel and additional VMT. And in essence, what it means is we have to find ways to reduce VMT just because the costs have changed, not because of anything else. And we're likely to see that for a while. The next slide is for anybody who keeps track of PMI and maintenance in our region, gets this, that over the longer time frame, the average pavement condition in and these are all PCI indexes, average for our region, has been declining. SB1 hopefully will give us some additional funds in the short term to make some progress on that and get to a better state of good repair. I think the last slide was really about congestion. In the longer haul, congestion has been increasing. The recession years, just because so many people stopped traveling for work and avoided travel for other reasons like shopping and that kind of thing. We had a little pause in growth and congestion in our region, but that's starting as the economies come back. That started to increase again, and anecdotally in the last couple of years, it's really spiked. Our ability to make progress on overall congestion in our region is going to be tough as we continue to grow, and we're interested in figuring out if pricing is a part of that. So that's all I had on this item, and I'll leave a minute or so pause for anybody to think of and write any questions that they've got.
questions come in.
Okay, so we're not seeing any questions come in, so we'll go ahead and move on to new mobility.
Thanks, Adrian, and I'll try not to be offended that nobody asked any questions. So one question in general that has come up in various forms from our board through the course of the MTP and the SCS is really related to our ability to predict in any meaningful way what the future is going to be, especially related to travel and transportation. And most of that really stems from people observing how quickly the present is changing with new modes and new ways of traveling emerging, weekly, monthly, yearly. And then there's just a drumbeat of concern related to longer term, the expectation that autonomous vehicles are going to play a bigger and bigger and bigger role in how we travel in our region and elsewhere in the country, elsewhere in the world for that matter. And with that amount of change going on in just the options that people have, the meaning and the value of a 20-plus year forecast into the future of travel, which we do and we have to do as part of our long-range plan updates, it's a paradox that people have a hard time resolving. And we've gone to our board with a couple items recently to talk about that topic, and we totally recognize that the future is a very uncertain thing at this moment, and it's not likely to get any less certain in the near future. So it's something we're going to have to navigate our way through as best we can. And so this item came to our board in April, I think? Yeah, April. As a way of just recognizing that and letting them know kind of what we're trying to do to continue to be productive in terms of what the value of that long-term forecast is going to be. So again, this slide just sort of covers the issues that we've really had a pretty long discussion with our board over the last few months. And again, it's recognizing how people travel is changing quickly, Uber and Lyft today, autonomous vehicles soon. And one of the things, SACOG is trying to be active in adapting our travel model and in keeping track of what things are going on in our region and elsewhere in the country and participating actively in research. We're very fortunate on that last point to have within the region a really great research university at UC Davis. They have a whole, there's a UTC, a University Transportation Center there, the ITS, the Institute of Transportation Studies. They fund a lot of research. And then there's a Three Revolutions research program that started at Davis that's looking at the three revolutions being automation of travel or autonomous vehicles, shared mobility, and electrification as sort of the three revolutions that are facing transportation. And they're doing they're funding and doing a lot of great research on that topic. It's a huge asset to have in our region, and we're trying to do more collaborative research with UC Davis and partnership research. And some of that is actually happening. With more time, we could go into details on that. But SACOG is definitely actively trying to participate in that. In terms of monitoring, one of the things that we're really looking to and have been trying to be active in is utilization of big data as part of how we monitor what's going on in transportation in our region. And we've got a partnership with Caltrans, statewide Caltrans, and ARB to do big data acquisition. We've got the funding lined up. We've got the partnership agreements almost lined up, and we hope to be going out with an RFP to do a year to 2 year acquisition of access to big data services to allow us to use big data in a way connected to a transportation planning process. And so that's one example of what we're doing there. And then in terms of adapting our travel demand model, we use a travel demand activity simulation model. We were the first MPO in the country to use one of those simulation models. And the software vendor for that, the travel demand software that we use, has been real active in taking the research that the Federal Highway Administration is doing at a national level and on autonomous vehicles and sharing of vehicles like through Uber and Lyft type sharing. And they've actually, within the software that we use, they've developed a module that allows for scenario testing of autonomous vehicles and shared vehicles. We're testing that, and we will be one of the first MPOs to use that for a scenario evaluation. I'll get to that in just a minute. But one thing that we do have to recognize in terms of just our statutory function as an MPO, we have some statutory functions related to the implementation of the Clean Air Act, the air quality conformity process, and irrespective of what we do with our travel demand models, the budgets and the targets that are set for us for the Clean Air Act won't include a bunch of changes around autonomous vehicles and shared mobility for quite some time. So we have budgets and targets to meet in the Clean Air Act that will treat the future as more of an extension of the present in terms of the types of modes that are available. There's a similar thing will be true for the greenhouse gas targets that we'll have to meet. So our advice to our board and our proposal to the board was to maintain a baseline set of travel forecasts that the MTP and the SCS that will be built around, and it will include the types of modes that are available today, including some of the shared modes. We are working to get Uber and Lyft, the TNC type mode option, fully into the travel model, and use that travel model to forecast a set of baseline forecasts that we use to build our plans. And then in parallel with that, we'll be doing a risk analysis where we take some of the functionality of our travel demand model that focuses on sharing and autonomous vehicles and potentially even connected vehicles, and do a risk analysis of the MTP SCS as a separate parallel analysis. And that risk analysis would really help us to identify where there are significant risks if automation takes a particular course moving into the future, or if our region was able to achieve a certain level of sharing of vehicles in the future, but treat those as future scenarios and look at the risks that are attached to that, and have a separate risk analysis that we would use to identify some areas where we need to be active in terms of developing policy as time goes on. And some of that policy might relate to things like, you hear a lot about curb management as an area of policy where our member agencies will have to be active, and for sure some of our member agencies are already active in that area. But there's a lot of other areas that we probably need to start thinking about related to AVs, autonomous vehicles, and sharing of vehicles that we haven't really thought of so far. We're hoping that this risk analysis will help us provide some information that will help us identify what those policy areas need to be. We won't be able to fully specify programs and projects and fully specified policies, but I think we need to at least identify the areas where we need to be active moving into the future. And that's our basic plan for how to treat all this uncertainty and new modes of travel for this purposes of the MTP and the SCS. The next slide just gives you a little bit of a timeline. So summer, we're trying to complete the testing of this avian sharing functionality of the travel demand model, and we're doing that partly on our own and partly in concert with a few other MPOs around the country that are looking at the same issues as us. And then in the fall, we intend to use some of that functionality to do some testing around the discussion draft scenario that Clint described earlier. And that would all lead to, in December, documenting some of the findings and results of that work to report that out to our board, and hopefully use that risk analysis, that separate risk analysis, to help again identify where there are fundamental risks to our plan moving forward and achievement of some of the performance objectives of our plan based on those two main areas of future mobility. That's all I had on this item, and I'll pause again for questions on that. Threw a lot at you. I appreciate people sticking with this, but hopefully we can continue on with this dialogue in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. And that's a good reminder to note that the staff reports that Bruce has mentioned throughout his presentation are available on the SACOG.org website. If you go to the SACOG homepage at SACOG.org, you can click the About Us tab and see agendas. And all of the agendas from our committee and board meetings are posted there. You can also click the Regional Plans tab to learn more about the Blueprint and MTP and SCS. So continue to type in your questions for Bruce or Clint about the MTP, pricing, new mobility, all of the things we have discussed thus far. While we do that, we do have a question that came in during the presentations for the land use team, which is, land use growth will depend on transportation infrastructure. Is there any way to make the land use and transportation iterative rather than starting with allocations and keeping them static regardless of the transportation system?
So that's a good question. There's a lot in there, so I'm going to try to tackle it. I think part of that is I may have oversimplified by saying, we start with a land use allocation, then we build a transportation network. Our land use allocation, as we're building that, we start with existing infrastructure. We start with looking at where existing transportation infrastructure is and what its capacity is. We look at other infrastructure as well, sewer, water, that backbone infrastructure that can affect where different land uses occur. We start with that and build a land use allocation that makes the most sense, and then we will build up a transportation network to fit that land use allocation. Then as we do our testing, our performance analysis, it is an iterative process where we will look for opportunities to modify the land use side or modify the transportation side to kind of achieve some performance benefits. And that iterative process is something that we don't do in isolation. We will work with the local staff, the sponsoring agency staff in charge of building and maintaining the roadway system, and the planning staff that is really in charge of some of the land use planning at local agencies, along with our other stakeholders. So we do fully intend on it being an iterative process. I just may have oversimplified it by saying it's all land use first and transportation next. The land use does take into consideration transportation infrastructure.
Great, thank you, Clint. So it looks like we have a question for Bruce. What kind of risks do you expect from AVs or sharing?
Right, and great question. So two of the real common risks that are, and it's not me who's thinking this one up, it's risks that they've come up in a lot of different areas around the country related to AVs. So if we're in a transportation system where automated or autonomous vehicles are really available to almost anybody, and being in that vehicle and using that vehicle doesn't require you to drive, you can do all sorts of other activities in the vehicle. You can work, you can make phone calls, you could eat, you could do almost anything. And will that flexibility encourage people to devalue the time that they spend in a vehicle? In other words, if you are at the wheel controlling the vehicle, your ability to drive, say, 50 miles for a commute trip is subject to your endurance and your ability to focus for that long. If instead you're able to make a bunch of work phone calls and work on your computer and watch a movie or something, maybe you don't care that you're driving 50 miles a day to your job. And so that's one of the risks, is that people won't care as much about the time they spend in the vehicle, and because of that, they'll travel a lot further and there will be a lot more miles on the road as a result. A second risk from AV that you hear a lot about is somebody using an autonomous vehicle to, say, avoid parking. So if you had an autonomous vehicle, could you use that autonomous vehicle and your current workplace is, say, downtown or someplace where you have to pay for parking? You have an autonomous vehicle. Do you have the autonomous vehicle drop you at work and then return home and not park at all, and then come back and get you at work and take you back home? So instead of making one trip to work and one trip home, the vehicle is driving home empty and then driving back to get you empty. So it's 4 trips instead of 2, if that makes any sense. Those are the types of risks that people attach to autonomous vehicles. And those are the types of things we're going to be looking at as potential risks to the performance of our plan and reduction of greenhouse gases and that kind of thing.
Great, thank you, Bruce. So continue to type your questions into the chat box. We'll address them for the next few minutes. We will be sending a follow-up email with a recording of this webinar and the slide deck that we presented today. So if you want to look more thoroughly at any of the slides within this presentation, you'll be able to do that. And this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the SACOG website. So while you're thinking of your final questions, we do want to issue a poll. Earlier this year, we decided to host these MTP SCS updates via webinar. We want to know if that's working for you, or if you would prefer to have more in-person meetings, more emails, or a combination of those. So please answer the webinar on the screen. We'll leave it open for a few minutes and continue to type your questions into the chat box. Okay, great. We're not getting any more questions coming through the question box, but it looks like a webinar is the best way to host these meetings, so we'll definitely share that amongst the whole MTP team. We'll leave the webinar open for just another minute or so while you type in your final questions, and then we'll be sending a follow-up email and posting this webinar on the SACOG website within the week.
One addition to that, I see webinar is the majority, but there's a significant group, a third or so, that said yes, would like occasional in-person meetings. It would be really great if we could get some feedback, whether email or in the chat, as to what are the points at which you would like that in-person meeting. Is it when a decision is coming up? Is it at your request? If there's some additional information for folks who pick that option, to let us know when we should consider scheduling in-person meetings, we'd really appreciate it.
Okay, we're going to close out the webinar today. Final reminder that you can reach out to any of the MTP team or Bruce here on the screen. Their email information is below their name. You can also find contact information for all SACOG staff on the SACOG website, and you can click the About Agendas tab to see any of the staff reports and regional plans to learn more about the 2020 MTP. With that, we'll close the webinar. Thank you for participating today. We look forward to sending you an email follow-up within the week. Have a great day, everyone.